Welcome back to part 3 of Reinventing the Whale with me, Matt Harvey, Philippa Breaks and Joe Rowan. We've talked about whale poo. Are there other whale emissions that have concerned you or been interesting?
So a lot of my career has been spent looking for whale poo, and we've used all different kinds of ways. And one of the most effective was developed by friends of mine, Rolland and Scott Krause. And there's been this rise of wildlife detecting dogs to find grizzly poop or pumas or bobcats, and they thought, well, if it works on land, maybe it can work on water too. So they hired out 2 scat sniffing dogs to look for whale feces in the Bay of Fundy. And the dogs could find it at a nautical mile away, so they could detect it.
On board the vessel, sniffing
the air? On board the vessel, that's right, on the small skiff. And Roz is with this dog, and in this case, it was Fargo, who was a Rottweiler, whose first job was as a companion dog, but the elderly woman died, and then he became a drug sniffing dog in a prison, and then he got what I think is a dream job for most dogs, which is wildlife detecting dog, looking for different types of feces, and eventually got hired.
You used the phrase scat detector.
Scat detector. That's right. That was its job. That was Fargo's job. And he was very good at finding whale feces. In this case, they were looking for right whales, largely because they were interested in hormones, detecting whether the whales were pregnant or other things or sick. And also later on looking at the nutrients, which is what I'm interested in, this whale pump idea. So this was great success in finding these fecal plumes, but what is really hard to find, and is probably just as important, is whale urine, which is also rich in phosphorus and nitrogen. And whales, unlike dogs or people, probably don't have much of a bladder because they can just pee all the time. Right. We don't, but the problem is, from my point of view, is you can't see it. Right. It's very hard to observe, except on the occasion when a male is swimming on his back and you can see sort of a fountain of pee. Those are incredibly rare and you can't really get close enough to collect it. So what we've been doing is basically mostly modeling. So we understand how much whales eat, and then we're looking at the passage of those nutrients, largely phosphorus and nitrogen. Earlier on, I had mentioned one thing, that whales are considered capital breeders. So they feed at a certain time of year and they breed in another. So they bulk up, especially the females, in the summer, and then in the winter, they go down to the Caribbean or Hawaii. They're probably not pooping there because they're not feeding, but they're peeing because they're metabolizing, right? So they're breaking down the fats, the lipids that they bulked up on, and even the proteins, even the muscle mass, because they're having a multi-ton calf, and then they're lactating, and then they're swimming back. So they're expending a ton of energy. So what we've been doing recently with funding from whale and dolphin conservation is looking at how important is that ecologically to systems like Hawaii and to the Caribbean. And what we're finding preliminary is it's more than the physical nitrogen that's in that area. So nitrogen can be coming up from the bottom of the ocean. Whales are bringing more nitrogen from those high latitudes to the low latitudes, which are typically, they're called oligotrophic, or they have low nitrogen, low nutrient levels. So this nitrogen can be really important, comparable to what, let's say, seabirds are doing, feeding offshore and then releasing nitrogen onto land. But in this case, the whales are going thousands of kilometers back and forth. So the dogs have helped us solve the problem a bit of how to find scats, but finding pee in the wild remains elusive. We're still trying to figure out how we're going to get that. For those of us who study scats and other things scatological, there are lots of videos on the internet about different various animals pooping or peeing, but whales are relatively uncommon. At least try seeing these images.
Right.
But we're working on it.
So have you personally seen a whale, a whale on its back?
Yes. Yeah. So you see, especially, you often see with North Atlantic right whales, one of the most spectacular things I've ever seen in my life, actually, is a courtship group or surface active group of North Atlantic right whales. So you have one focal female, can be surrounded by 1, 2, 3, a dozen males coming in from all over, and they're trying to copulate with that female. She's on her back to avoid copulation. And then, so you will often see males coming in. You might see what we call a sea snake or a penis reaching out above the surface. And because this is what I do and what I'm interested in, there's often a lot of crap in the water. For whatever reason, the females are often, it's like a poop volcano. The females are often putting a lot of poop in the water, and the males are too. So we think of there's a relationship between sex and productivity in right whales in that way. So we've been that has been a very fertile way, so to speak, of trying to find the feces in this area, and we think it's also important ecologically.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I've got quite colourful images now in my mind, which I appreciate. I can handle it. We're just on that edge of the not safe for work warning coming up for people. I feel, and a lot of interest also from places we didn't expect to get it from. But that's okay. They'll come for the golden showers and stay for the whale and dolphin conservation work.
It's culturally diverse. It's all good.
Yes, culturally diverse. Thank you, Philippa. That's what I wanted to, say. I want to. There's this area of the impact of human interventions, the knock-on effect of our depleting of whales. Is that something you could enlarge upon?
Sure. There's one fascinating study. So we've been talking about how whales can impact ecosystems by feeding, and also when they die through their what we call whale falls, and also through feces and pee. But they also can be prey, especially to killer whales. So there have been a couple of studies from the North Pacific that have suggested that when we removed the great whales, humpback whales, and fin whales and other species from the ocean as a result of commercial whaling, killer whales, which fed on these, especially on their calves, were left with no food, right? So they switched prey and focused on pinnipeds or seals and sea lions. When those numbers went down, they started feeding on quite small organisms for a killer whale, which are sea otters. And there's increased evidence showing that they are indeed feeding on these small sea otters. Why does that matter from our perspective? Is sea otters are the predominant predator of sea urchins, which is a spiky invertebrate that's found at the bottom, on the benthic or bottom of the oceans, and they feed on kelp. So if there's no sea otters, there are a lot of sea urchins and no kelp. They're called urchin barrens. When the otters returned, then the kelp was restored. So we find more of these kelp forests. And as a result, perhaps, this is still, people would debate this, of commercial whaling, killer whales switched eventually to sea otters, and now we see sea otter populations decline and kelp decline as well. I think there's increased evidence to show that the killer whales are feeding on the otters. It might only be a few of them. The connection to commercial whaling is still debated in the scientific circle, I think, but colleagues of mine like Jim Estes have made a pretty strong case that commercial whaling can have incredible effects, knock-on effects that we wouldn't expect.
Right. But it feels like your colleague is bringing along what I would call, to layperson, just a holistic way of looking at this. And so the ripple effects, or I suppose the systemic effects, are considered and almost assume that there are going to be such ripples and consequences, and looking at what they are. But this way of it's almost as if this way of looking at things is still having to prove itself or earn the respect of the wider community. Is that true? That the holistic way of looking?
I think so. I mean, I think these connections to nutrients, to other ecological impacts, it's an exciting time to be studying that, because we're finding more evidence for this from everything from the whales we've been discussing to hippos, to bison, to seabirds and midges. And it's really an exciting time that we're really starting to change our view. And whales are an important part of this. So another cool study that's happened is when whales were depleted in the southern hemisphere, we were talking about the removal of 99% of blue whales, the largest animals ever to exist on the planet, taking all of them basically to where there are none left. People thought, well, their main prey, which is krill, small shrimp-like creature, would probably come back, right? So you take out the predators, the prey comes back. We didn't find much evidence for that. Surprisingly, krill populations seem to have been fairly stable, even after we removed their main predator. One hypothesis is that in addition to taking the predator out, we also took out the nutrients that were supplied by these blue whales. So blue whales, their feces has high concentrations of iron, which is the limiting nutrient in that area. So perhaps one reason the krill didn't come back is you didn't no longer have this whale pump operating in these areas. Again, early days, some would argue, well, maybe that iron does not get released in the way we think, but I think there's a compelling hypothesis and importantly, real need for research to look at all of these effects, right? All of these nutrient subsidies that we really weren't looking for as recently as, let's say, 40 or 50 years ago.
Just to sort of distill, if you like, the underlying theme there as well, I think, which you see in Joe's work and others, is that it's just a beautiful example of how truly interconnected ecosystems are. So, we started with the idea of sort of the food pyramid with an apex predator and the sort of the smaller organisms at the bottom, and then we kind of evolved into the idea of food webs and it being much more complicated. And now Joe's work helps to sort of demonstrate that actually these things can be interconnected, but not just currently, across timescales as well, which is really, really important. So it makes our job of conserving whales and just conserving the natural world actually quite complicated, and sort of really speaks to the importance of diversity too. I think the diversity that we inherited when the Industrial Revolution came around had taken quite a long time to come into balance. And so we have shifted that balance, and restoring that balance isn't necessarily as simple as restoring one particular species. So yeah, I think it's basically very complicated.
Right. So there aren't particular, just by stopping doing one thing, or that's not necessarily going to help. But we obviously need to bring a complex approach.
One way of thinking about it is I was talking about the Marine Mammal Protection Act and a focus on whales in the 1970s, which was very important in the United States and elsewhere to protect whales, save the whales, right? But it's much more than that. And in a way, I think they acted as ambassadors for understanding that we needed to protect all species, that all species are important. I spoke to someone who wrote some of that early legislation. And he said there's a reason they picked whales and not freshwater mussels, right? People care about whales. If you had a freshwater mussel protection act, it's not going to get that level of support. But it's not that they're not just as important. They are. All of these animals, the ecosystems are essential. We can save whales, that's fine, and stop killing whales. But if we destroy their ecosystem, they're going to disappear anyway, right? And we're doing that, right? So this is really what I think the focus is saving the species and the ecosystems where all of these animals are found. and acknowledging and understanding that they've changed. Not only the great whale conveyor belt that we spoke about, which is whales moving nutrients across long distances, but this would be true in the Amazon and places around the world. There are still legacies in the Amazon of animals from the Pleistocene, from more than 10,000 years ago. You can see where they moved by the phosphorus that was left there, or evolutionary changes in the plants that were building defenses against animals that no longer exist, or they have seeds that were dependent on animals to disperse it that are gone, right? We understand in a lot of ways, I think, the terrestrial systems. We live there, we can walk there, it's a little easier to study. That doesn't mean that the same issues aren't happening in the oceans. We're at the very beginning now of understanding. The big concern is that we're not doing everything we can, not only to protect the animals that we're interested in, the whales and the dolphins, but also all the other organisms in the oceans. If we don't save the oceans, the whales are going to disappear. If the whales disappear, the oceans are going to change. They already have. Bringing that together really is the next step. The good news is there are good people out there. There are good scientists and activists out there working to make these changes through things like marine protected areas, right? So rather than focused on a single species, let's protect entire ecosystems from devastating impacts like bottom trawling, fishing, or other things, not just the direct take, but also all the other impacts. This is a tough one, right? Because it means climate, it means plastics. So this is a heavy lift, but I believe we can do it, and I think we have to do it.
I think it's absolutely essential, really. It's not really an option. It's a bit like dealing with climate change too. These things are no longer optional, really. But also, I think what we're just on the cusp of understanding is, beyond the sort of biological, mechanistic aspect of whales and dolphins' lives, and other organisms in the oceans, we're understanding that we're beginning to understand them in different ways as well. So culture is one way that we're starting to understand them, and we are very likely losing cultures at a much faster rate than we're able to describe them, because we've only just developed the tools to be able to measure them and quantify them. But also within those cultures, there are individuals doing individual things, and through some of these really good, solid, long-term data sets that we have from researchers who spent years of their lives on boats following individuals around, we're able to determine that some individuals behave differently, and we call it, over their lifetime, it's called consistent individual difference in science. In normal human speak, that's called personality. Now we're just on the cusp of being able to describe personality traits in whale and dolphin species. We're really in the early stages, and it's, as Joe mentioned, this is largely the result of the fact that we can follow a gorilla or a chimpanzee or a giraffe or a sparrow for many hours of its life, but actually seeing the vast majority of what whales and dolphins are doing is below the surface, so it's actually very difficult to determine what they're doing a lot of the time. But we've had a slight, I think we're just getting a small insight into it in a study that I'm involved with in WDC's North American office of Stellwagen Bank. We have a study since 2016 there looking at lobtail feeding, which is a particular kind of feeding that humpbacks do in only that part of the world. It's never really been recorded anywhere else in the world. And so humpbacks can feed in several different ways, but this particular lobtail feeding is basically where the whale lifts their tail out of the water, and then they will smack the surface of the water with their tail, and then they'll dive down, and we're assuming that probably what happens is that they're stunning the fish when this happens. And then they'll dive down and they might blow a few bubbles, and then they'll come up with a mouthful of fish. And what's quite interesting is that we've observed that there are different styles that the whales have. Some of them will kind of like do a few slaps at the surface. Some of them will kind of do a bit of a twisted slap and, you know, a bit of style in there. And others will actually, there's one in particular who'll lift their chin out of the water, slap the surface with their chin first, and then do the tail slap. So the thing that I'm interested in is this sort of competency? Are they learning over time to do a better job of this so that they, you know, get more food? Or is this actually just a different style that they have that they carry through their whole lifetime? But in observing this, what has been quite interesting and unexpected is that we've observed that there are what I like to think of as goal hangers. There will be a single whale that will kick, and quite often that whale will be observed with maybe one or two others, sometimes youngsters, sometimes not, that will then sweep in and get a mouthful of food. So they're doing, you know, none of the work but getting all of the profits. And
Right.
and this idea of producer's grandeur is sort of a common phenomenon that you see across other sorts of taxa. And so by observing whales over long periods of time, that's the kind of information that we can start to tease apart. But as I say, we're really only at the beginning of kind of understanding them as individuals in that way, because it's taken us such a long time to get to where we are now, which is sort of understanding their biology and understanding their life histories. So we are in many ways several decades behind the primatologists in our understanding of them as individuals, and it's just the practicality of being able to spend time with them. But once we start to understand them more as individuals, I think that helps to inform our duties towards them, because it makes them more relatable the more diverse they are, I think. So, yeah.
I can see that. I mean, I find it very exciting and kind of tantalizing, the sense that we are beginning to apprehend this, what you were calling consistent individual differences.
Yeah, that's right. It's not quite as snappy as personality, is it? But, you know, scientists, we like to make things sound complicated wherever possible. But I think one of the great challenges for humans is when we look at any other system, it's quite difficult not to look at any other biological system from the perspective of humans, but particularly when it comes to sort of what we see as psychological attributes like personality, for example. And so, you know, there's some recent research which has been done, which is, you know, really good, on bottlenose dolphins and where they sit on the bold shy continuum. And we can only, you know, there's only a certain amount of the behavior of other species that we are able to interpret because we can measure it, right? But what we always have to keep in mind is all species have evolved to be perfectly adapted for the niche in which they inhabit. And so they may well have personality traits that humans don't have, because we don't need them, whereas they may need them. So we always have to keep, I think, remember that we see everything through the goggles of a human. And that's very difficult to detach from, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I hear that we sort of anthropomorphize everything around us, but it might be good that at least we are seeing the whale as worthy of anthropomorphizing, and we're beginning to project ourselves in that, you know, as if we are beginning to humanize them, as it were, as we have done with other creatures that we value, with other beings, other mammals. I hope it's a good thing that we at least are trying to see what they might be like, and saying, oh, I see they have personalities, but we're not quite ready to say personality. We will talk about consistent individual differences. In the same way, apparently psychiatrists talk about unconditional positive regard instead of saying love. We're in that sort of place. We're beginning to have unconditional positive regard. But can we look to the future? I mean, here's hopefully a positive question. What would be the impact on the ocean and the planet if whale and dolphin populations were to actually recover?
There would be multiple impacts. And one of the most exciting, I think, is restoring these nutrient pathways around ocean, within ocean basins and across the world. So why is that important? Well, one, it'll affect the productivity in these areas, and two, it can have an impact on carbon and the carbon cycle as well, right? So we're very much focused on that idea. So more whales certainly would likely result in higher productivity in parts of the ocean, as well as some increased carbon sequestration, either when they die or in their biomass. We don't have trees in the ocean, but we have large animals. We have large whales, we have large fish, and they're composed of carbon, right? So that could have a big difference as well. And then we've been talking today about the importance of diversity, and as well as the importance of individuals, right? So both of those go towards ocean health. And I found Philippa's comments fascinating. And we're starting to see these individual patterns with everything from grasshoppers to, it's not just large mammals. They don't have to be large sentient mammals. Grasshoppers react differently when there's a sit and wait spider. Some will, when they're in the cage, they'll just go about their lives as if there's no other problem. Others will hide in the corner the whole time when they're seeing. So that variation occurs across taxa. As we restore whales, we're going to see all kinds of new things. We've been talking about things that if we were chatting 20 years ago, almost none of these topics probably would have come up, because we didn't know that, right? In another 20 years, think about where, I don't know, none of us know where we'd be, but if we had this chat in 20 years, we're going to find all different kinds of new patterns about the ocean's health, about whales, about what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong, and hopefully how we can fix it.
Let's make a date to have this conversation in 20 years, shall we?
You got it. Okay, done.
I'll be here.
I'm in.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know. I want to ask, because what your hopes are for how things might change as this century unfolds.
That's a huge question, isn't it? But for me, the vast majority of the work that I do is, I hope, trying to change the way that we see others, those others that are beyond humans, really. And I feel that the more that we are able to understand what it's like to be others. I mean, we live in an amazing time in terms of our own populations. There are incredible social movements that we are living through right now, which are helping us to understand what it's like to come from a different racial group, to be of a different sexual orientation, whatever the previous conceived difference was, we're starting to understand that. And to me, I think the more that we are able to understand the other species that we share the planet with, the better or more motivated we're going to be to protect them, because we're going to realise what it is that we are losing. But I think we have to be really careful in how we do that, because it's very tempting to look at the things that make them like us. But actually, it's also the ways in which they're not like us, that it also makes them remarkable and incredible. And the best, I think that the best that we can hope for is some sort of understanding of both the extrinsic and intrinsic value of whales and dolphins to become really mainstream, much deeper than just the simple Save the Whale movement, so that we really value their environments and we protect their environments, which has such a wonderful then knock-on effect for not just whales and dolphins, but for all the other species. That's hugely ambitious, but that's what I hope for.
I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, to that, and it very much motivates the work that I do as well. The only practical hope that I have beyond that, and I think that is the ultimate goal that Philippa has just expressed, is that that the oceans are not looked at as a place where we're extracting things and dumping things, which has been for most of human history one or the other. I started working on one of the most endangered whales in the world. It's the Gulf of Mexico whale. There are only about 30 to 40 individuals left on the planet. They're found in an area where there's intense oil extraction, lots of noise, military activity. When I started out, I'm like, I don't know how these guys are going to make it. But I know we're going to get beyond fossil fuels someday. We just got to do it fast, right? The sooner we do it, the better. That's how we could really improve oceans if we move away from fossil fuel extraction for so many reasons. That's one practical step that I just hope we bring about very soon.
I really appreciate the clarity and the passion with which you have shared your knowledge with us. I thank you very much for that. And I really, that sense of, I don't know, the sense of imaginative empathy and compassion towards the cetaceans, towards the whales and their wider home that you have spoken of is a powerful thing, that it feels understandable the way in which you've said it. It feels achievable in the way in which you have put it across.
Matt, it was great to see you, and Philippa, it's really a pleasure to learn about what you're doing.
What a pleasure it is to be able to talk about whales and dolphins. So no, it's lovely to meet you both, Matt and Joe. So yeah, I really appreciate it very much.
Thank you.